Okay, so somehow it passed the entirety of my attention, most likely because the interview happened in French, that Masashi Kishimoto decided to give his second interview since the beginning of Boruto a couple of days ago. Or an interview was broadcasted of Masashi Kishimoto and Ikemoto talking about Boruto in France. I don't know, it's hazy. And while I did hear about this interview, basically the day that it happened, when I typed in Kishimoto French interview, literally nothing came up. And thus, as I do with a lot of information given to me over email, I assume that somebody scrolled too deep in a subreddit and bought something that wasn't real. And while that could still absolutely be what's going on here, because for the life of me, I can't find any actual official reports on Kishimoto and Ikemoto's interview, it seems as though about a week ago there was an event in France called the Kana event. And at this Kana event, Ikemoto and Kishimoto were asked a series of questions about both Naruto and Boruto. And as Kishimoto stepping out into the sunlight is exceedingly rare, and him answering questions about his IP is even more exceedingly rare, this is kind of a big deal. However, unfortunately, how big of a deal it is kind of up in the air, because there seem to be somewhat conflicting reports on what was asked and how it was answered. See, there's Twitter threads created by accounts like Boruto Naruto FR that show all of the questions asked and how they were answered. However, there's also transcripts on places like fanverse.org that appear to be a more accurate, complete telling of what was said and asked during this interview. And therefore, you might ask, well, then who do we trust here? Do I trust Twitter? Do I trust Fanverse? And when it comes down to it, today I'm actually gonna be trying to trust both of them, but more leaning towards Fanverse. And I have a pretty solid reason for this. Released an article a couple of days after the transcripts of this interview were released. And the article that they released was called "The Mistranslation of Naruto's Creator Masashi Kishimoto's Opinion on Sarada Shakes the Anime Community." Now, specifically, what this is in reference to is when Kishimoto was asked by the interviewer which one of Ikemoto's character designs is your favorite. A mistranslation from Japanese to French and then French to English made it seem as though Kishimoto said, "I like Sarada in her young woman outfit because she's a sexy lady." Now, this comment, while not documented in the Twitter thread, is documented in the fanverse.org transcripts. Now, in actuality, this mistranslation was actually just Kishimoto saying that Sarada's design is cool and not sexy, but still, the important takeaway here is that one of the transcripts about this interview has this comment attached and the other doesn't. And yes, Kishimoto did not say that Sarada was sexy. He said her design was kakui and not sekushi. And yes, sexy in Japanese is sekushi. If you're a white guy speaking Japanese, a lot of the time it just sounds like you're being kind of racist. When I was learning Japanese about a year ago, I was trying to learn how to tell people my profession, and full-time YouTuber in Japanese is full-timer YouTuber. Yeah, it's bad. But anyways, we have a lot to talk about today from this interview, as this interview not only spurred controversy amongst the Naruto and Boruto community, but it also opened our eyes to the relationship between Kishimoto and Ikemoto and how they approach the story of Boruto. On top of this, it stated that Kishimoto hinted at another manga project in the works during this interview. So yeah, whenever Kishimoto does decide to step outside and talk to us about Naruto and Boruto, you best believe it's big news. So let's get to chatting about this historical event, because today we're talking Kishimoto's interview explained. But before we get to explaining anything, guys, please, for me, like this video, subscribe to the page, and hit that noti bell. And if you're feeling particularly generous, go ahead and follow my other YouTube channel, The Weeb Commander, where instead of talking about Naruto and Boruto, I talk all other anime and manga. Or if you just want to see me try to bring real-life challenges to the anime world, go ahead and follow my brand new channel that I created with Stephen He, Chris Barnett, and Danny Mata called Anime IRL. Or if you just want to hear me talk about anime and manga, go ahead and follow my anime podcast, Otaku's Anonymous, where me and Danny Mata break down everything that happened in anime and manga this week. It's available on YouTube, Spotify, and Apple Podcasts. So when it really comes down to it, I alone feel like the only person who would make a video talking about how the 10 paths are gonna retcon the beginning of Boruto, just for it to be revealed like that day that Kishimoto had just done an interview talking about how he was the person who started Boruto off like that. Listen, we've said it before, our hit rate's not 100%. However, all hope is not lost for the theory. Technically, the 10 paths could still retcon the beginning that Kishimoto decided for Boruto, as during this interview, he actually openly admits the fact that he didn't think about the beginning of Boruto all that much. He kind of just did it. But yeah, not a great look. Thank God I'm pretty, because God, am I wrong sometimes. Anyways, let's talk about this interview. I'm going to be basing what I'm talking about today based off a transcript on fanverse.org posted by somebody by the name of Yagami1211, because I believe it's probably going to be the most accurate transcript we'll get until the official translation is out. and thus do take everything we talk about today with a grain of salt. This is not an official translation and therefore shouldn't be deemed as 100% true. I'm just moving based off what I believe to be the most accurate transcript we currently have. The first question of this interview, at least so far as we know, is directed towards Kishimoto. As it says, Mr. Kishimoto, Naruto has educated millions of young French children and has been the best-selling manga for a long time. Do you realize the love that France has for your work? To which Kishimoto responds by saying, I didn't really realize it. I just drew what was inside of me, and the readership understood me. That's the impression I have. Cool, kind of a softball question. Of course, they're gonna be like, hey, we love you here. Like, obviously, look at the crowd. The second question is directed at Ikemoto, and it says, Mr. Ikemoto, you're originally an assistant on Naruto, and you find yourself as the author of its sequel, Boruto. For each of you, how did this experience change? Now, this is actually rather interesting, because the dynamic between Kishimoto and Ikemoto has always been kind of hazy to us. See, obviously, for the first 52 chapters of Boruto, Kishimoto was just a supervisor, and his two assistants, Kodachi and Ikemoto, were creating Boruto. It was widely assumed by all that Kodachi was doing the majority of the writing and Ikemoto was doing the majority of the drawing. However, this interview makes it feel as though that the relationship between the three of them was much more transient than we even believed, as Ikemoto, throughout the entirety of this interview, was constantly referred to as the author of Boruto. However, this interview also hammers home the fact that Kishimoto and Ikemoto worked together on all writing aspects, and thus it feels as though while Kishimoto might be heavily involved in the big plot points, basically storyboarding the entirety of the story, it seems as though a lot of the minuscule, more minor details are actually decided upon by Ikemoto. Ikemoto just responds to this by saying, indeed, I was Master Kishimoto, that's just an English translation of Kishimoto-senpai's assistant on Naruto. I mainly drew the backgrounds for Boruto, which is my manga. The work is no longer the same at all. Now that's crazy. Ikemoto referring to Boruto as his manga. Kishimoto then chips in by saying, I think I improved my drawing for Boruto, and honestly I tend to agree, considering the fact that when Kishimoto decided to fire Kodachi 52 chapters in and take a more dominant role in terms of storyboarding and drawing, the artwork actually does pretty vastly improve post that change. The interviewer then asks which characters from the Naruto universe do you feel the closest to in terms of personality, and why? Kishimoto responds by saying, I feel really close to Naruto. On the surface, I may seem fragile and a bit of an otaku, but inside, like Naruto, I have a mischievous and boisterous side. Cute. It's probably who I would relate to in Naruto as well, so that's reassuring, I guess. It's also somewhat interesting though, because Kurama is his favorite character. Ikemoto then responds by saying, for my part, I feel close to Boruto, not in terms of character, but in relation to his situation. Boruto has a remarkable father, Naruto. I feel in the same context, just like Boruto, I move forward and have doubts when I draw the series. See, basically what I believe that Ikemoto is saying here, even though it is poorly translated, is that he relates to Boruto the most because he himself also has an incredible father, but he also deals with doubts while moving forward, trying to decide if what he's doing is for the best. I think it's kind of dope that both Kishimoto and Ikemoto chose the main characters of their respective mangas. And honestly, with the major differences between Naruto and Boruto, you can very much sense that these two MCs were curated by different people. But Ikemoto, who is a genuine lover of the OG source material Naruto, knows how to keep Boruto well within the confines of what the Naruto community would want. But this is where the interview gets real interesting, at least for me. As the interviewers go on to ask, the Boruto series opens with a scene advanced in time before offering a very long flashback. Could you tell us about this choice of teaser and fratricidal duel? Fratricidal duel is a crazy way to say battle amongst brothers, but I really like it. And it's at this point that you could either tear my argument that the 10 paths are going to be used to retcon the beginning of Boruto to pieces, or use it to bolster that very same argument. Ikemoto responds to this question by saying, it's an idea from Master Kishimoto. Originally, we were supposed to start the Boruto manga like the Boruto Naruto The Next Generation's movie, which would just be Boruto as a Geni. However, suddenly, Master Kishimoto had the idea to introduce the more adult characters at the beginning of the story. Since it wasn't planned, I had to draw the character designs of older Boruto and Kawaki quite quickly. Now, this statement says a couple of things. One, starting the story off with Boruto and Kawaki facing down each other on top of the Hokage's stone faces was Kishimoto's idea. And that not great for my argument, if we're being real. My argument being that the 10 paths were introduced so that Kishimoto could write himself out of the constraints of Kodachi's storytelling, but it's his storytelling. However, rather interestingly, Kishimoto chips in after Ikemoto's response, saying, I hadn't thought deeply about this choice, but I thought that starting with older, more adult characters would allow for readers to wonder what could have happened to get there. In terms of hooks and teasers, it was more effective, but I admit that at that time, I didn't have any specific ideas for the rest of the story. At the time of Naruto, I was used to following a weekly publication schedule, so I had a very short deadline to draw. When I had ideas, I threw them into the plot like that, before seeing what I could do with them later. later. And there is a couple of very interesting things to unpack in that 5-sentence structure. One, basically what Kishimoto was saying is that I just threw adult Boruto and Kawaki into the beginning of Boruto as a hook. It was a retention strategy, like a thumbnail on YouTube. He basically clickbaited us with the adult versions of Boruto and Kawaki standing above a destroyed Konoha. However, he openly admits that when he created this moment, he didn't know what the story of Boruto was going to be, which means either this moment he created kind of out of nowhere, he's either had to build out the entirety of the storyline of Boruto to get to, or it was something he just threw on the page and is actively now trying to get rid of. Because here's the thing. Yeah, very clearly, adult Boruto and Kawaki standing across from each other above a destroyed Konoha was Kishimoto's idea. But he openly admits to the fact that the idea kind of came out of nowhere and that the story wasn't written when he made that plot point. And so, as to whether or not we're going to see that plot point or see it get retconned through a power like 10 paths, I genuinely don't know if we can say. It's pretty much the most confusing thing that could have happened after I released my most recent video. The creator of the manga literally being like, no, you're wrong on the Kodachi point, but you might be right on the fact that I don't want that to be the end of the story. The second most interesting point that Kishimoto brings up here is that while he was writing Naruto, he wasn't really thinking about what he was writing. And if we're going to be real with ourselves, makes sense. Like, if he was the kind of guy to just be like,
oh no, they're adults at the beginning. Throw that in, Ikemoto.
Then can you imagine what he was doing with his own manga? Because yes, while there is some foreshadowing in Naruto, if we're being real, the level of foreshadowing we get in Naruto pales in comparison to the likes of comparable manga like Hunter x Hunter or JJK or One Piece. And that might have just been because Kishimoto was just like, well, this week we're doing this. And you know what? He did a really good job. So genuinely, how can we hate? The interviewer then kicks in by saying your antagonists are rarely completely bad. They often have a past that can explain how they got there. Do you sincerely think that you can't be bad without a reason? To which Kishimoto answers, rather interestingly, that gives us perspective into what he's trying to accomplish with Boruto. Kishimoto responds by saying, it's true that I want to tell stories about humans. From the beginning, I had opportunities to make characters appear as supervillains, but as One Piece already did, I wanted to do it differently with Naruto. My bad characters also had a story. Manga is also an industry in which we have to create what doesn't yet exist, which pushes us to try different approaches. Now, this is kind of cool because One Piece did come out a couple of years prior to Naruto, and Oda and Kishimoto are very publicly very good friends. And thus the reason that all of the bad guys in Naruto seem to be lost heroes is because of how completely irredeemable a lot of the villains in One Piece are. That's dope. That's a dope thing to know. I don't know, maybe I'm nerding out, but that's a really cool thing to know. Like, Kishimoto saw the admirals and he was like, nope, too evil for me. I'm gonna go the other way. However, where the real interesting commentary comes in, at least for Boruto fans, is that Ikemoto, after Kishimoto's statement, says, I try not to duplicate Naruto. That's why there are more pure villains in Boruto. Big villains. And this is 100% accurate. In fact, almost all of the villains in Boruto are irredeemable, whether it be Momoshiki, Ishiki, or maybe even Kawaki, Code, or the rest of Kara. Pretty much all of the villains in Boruto have been irredeemably bad. Not lost heroes, just monsters. And while it is cool to learn about Ikemoto's approach to writing antagonists, there's also something else very important stated in this answer, which is Ikemoto saying that I try not to duplicate Naruto. And while by and large Boruto is a very, very different story from Naruto, there is definitely similar themes. However, though, if we move forward with the understanding that Ikemoto is trying to copy Naruto the least amount possible, theories like, oh, Boruto's gonna get the other half of Kurama's chakra, or the idea that after Naruto and Kawaki defeat a big, bad, possibly world-ending alien, they have their own fight to decide whether or not they're gonna be brothers again, kind of lose a fair amount of steam. If we know the author is actively trying to steer Boruto away from the plot of Naruto, then if we're theorizing about the future of Boruto based off what happened in Naruto, that may not be the best way to go about it. The interviewers then go on, and apparently there was like a lot of interviewers, go on to ask, Mr. Ikemoto, your characters have matured in Boruto 2 Blue Vortex. How did you work on this in your drawings? To which Ikemoto responds by saying, compared to the childhood part, there aren't that many differences in the design. 3 years have passed in the plot, so the characters have grown up quickly. Other than that, I haven't felt any changes in my work as an illustrator. Which is like a fair enough answer, right? The kids just grew up. Draw them older. Another interviewer chips in and asks, apart from manga, is there a film, a book, or a piece of music that has changed your vision of the world and shaped the person that you are? Now, Kishimoto answers this in kind of the exact way that you would assume that Kishimoto would answer this, by saying, I'll mainly mention films that I saw and loved when I was a child, especially Star Wars. I also like anything in the fantasy genre, like The Never-Ending Story and Back to the Future. And as it's always been known that Kishimoto is a giant sci-fi buff, him saying that he was inspired by Star Wars isn't all that crazy. It's why they're massively modernizing Boruto, it's why he wanted to create Samurai Number 8, and so on and so forth. The idea of blending sci-fi with ninjas in feudal Japan has always been something that Kishimoto loved. Kishimoto goes on to say, for literature, there's Run, Melos by Osamu Dazai, which is adapted into a film. This novel inspired me when I drew the original pilot chapter of Naruto. Now, Run, Melos is actually one of the most famous stories in all of Japan. It's a short story that was published in 1940 and is used widely in Japanese schools to teach Japanese literature. And honestly, once you read the story or watch the short film, seeing how it inspired Naruto is actually kind of crazy. See, Run, Melos is a story about a young shepherd who lives in a land ruled by an evil king by the name of Dionysus. And no, not that Dionysus. This king has a deep-seated distrust of all people, and therefore he kills basically everybody close to him. However, one day when Melos hears about his deeds, he decides to assassinate the king. However, when Melos breaks into the castle with a knife to assassinate the king, he's caught and he's sentenced to execution. However, Melos pleads with the king to give him 3 days to run back to his hometown to arrange his sister's wedding, saying that the king can take one of his friends as collateral to be executed should he not return in 3 days. And thus Melos runs back to his hometown and arranges his sister's wedding. However, after his sister's wedding, he oversleeps, which means that the amount of time he has to get back to the king to stop his friend from being executed is almost too short to get back to the king's city. And thus a large majority of the story revolves around Melos running back to the king to stop his best friend from being executed. And over the course of this run, he experiences a deluge of hardships, all of which he has to overcome in order to save his best friend's life. And if you can't see how that could have possibly inspired Naruto as a story, I got nothing for you. Kishimoto then continues on by saying, as for anime, I think of Akira and Ghost in the Shell. As for manga and comic book authors, I think of Mobius, Katsuhiro Otomo, and Taiyo Matsumoto. Now, Mobius, also known as Jean Giraud, is a French cartoonist who drew surrealism sci-fi art. It's actually really cool work. Katsuhiro Otomo is the creator of Akira, and Taiyo Matsumoto is the creator of Ping Pong and Sunny. Kishimoto then ponders for a second as he says out loud, wait, does any of this answer what I love about manga? And then he goes, oh yeah, also Dragon Ball. I haven't forgot about that, which is sweet because Kishimoto did look up to Akira Toriyama a lot. Ikemoto then steps in and says, as for cinema, I was influenced by the Matrix trilogy, especially in my way of drawing and in my compositions. In the first part, Neo appears as the savior, while in the second, he manages to control his power. It is similar to what distinguishes the childhood part from the young adult part of Boruto. As for manga, my influence remains Dragon Ball. Less to do with there. I mean, it's a pretty clear and concise answer. The interviewers then kick back in, asking Mr. Kishimoto, what is your favorite character design by Master Ikemoto? And it's at this point that the mistranslation occurs, as what was translated wrongly was, I would say, Sarada in the young woman version, because she is sexy. I could have never drawn it. In actuality, what he did say is, I would say Sarada in the young woman version because she's cool. I could have never drawn it. Ikemoto then says, from my part, among your characters, I really like Jiraiya, but concerning the design, my preference goes to Madara and Kakashi, to which Kishimoto responds by saying, oh, why? And it's weird that they've never had this conversation. Ikemoto then responds by saying, just by seeing them, we feel they are not ordinary characters. They are convincing. They just give off something. Kishimoto then responds by saying, oh, that makes me happy. Well, it's true that it's weird to compliment each other here in front of you, and then he trails off laughing. But that's cool. Kishimoto's favorite design from Boruto is Sarada post-time skip, which makes sense because she just looks like Itachi. And Ikemoto's favorite designs are Madara and Kakashi. And honestly, I tend to agree. I would just throw Tobirama in there and that'd be my perfect trilogy. Jiraiya's design is cool, but it's also already been designed like hundreds of years prior. Kakashi, Madara, and Tobirama were all unique characters created by Kishimoto. The interviewers then ask, the master-student relationship is very present in Naruto and Boruto. Even outside the shinobi education system, do you think that learning must necessarily go through tutoring? To which Kishimoto responds by saying, yes, I think that this system is important. I taught a lot of things to Master Ikemoto. If he draws so well, it's perhaps thanks to his apprenticeship with me. To which Ikemoto cuts in and says, no. Kishimoto then cuts him off and says, I've been a little jealous lately. I think I've taught him too much. To which Ikemoto once again goes, no. Continuing on by saying, I also think that the master-student relationship is very important. Even if there are things that we can't do alone or goals that we can't achieve, the younger generation can take over and make sure to achieve them. It's a universal theme, but not only for manga, it also concerns real life. Now that's interesting. What a fun and interesting thing to say, Ikemoto, the author of Boruto. Oh, the younger generation needs to accomplish the things that the previous generation could not? Almost as though in a somewhat roundabout way, we're confirming that Naruto was never the child of prophecy, and therefore in actuality, the person who was the child of prophecy was Boruto because he is still technically being trained by Jiraiya, just the clone of Jiraiya. And just like with all other sequels, the previous previous generation will become stronger than the last generation? Surely that's not what you're saying, Ikemoto, the author of Boruto. But before I can rant too much, the interviewers cut me off and say, what is the best advice that you have been given during your career? To which Kishimoto responds by saying, in my case, 2 words have stuck with me. The first is from Kusuke Yahagi, my first editor here. I'm more of the type to not have confidence in myself. It's not that I'm not motivated, but I lack confidence. I mean, yeah, he's a self-admitted otaku. That kind of thing is gonna happen. There, Mr. Yahagi wrote me a letter to tell me, you have talent. I believe in his words, they had an impact on me, which is kind of sweet, I guess. The second one is from my father. I was already a professional mangaka. It was hard, and I kept complaining to him. He told me, if you do what you love, don't complain. Which, you know, is not something I wouldn't expect to hear from somebody who was born in the 1920s in Japan. No, he was probably born like 70 years ago, so like the 1950s? Hopefully not the 1940s. I mean, none of those times were a good time to be in Japan, but still. But the sentiment does ring true. If you love what you do, don't complain. It's why I try to complain about being a YouTuber as little as possible. I'm uniquely blessed, and it's because each and every single one of you. Mwah. I do make so much goddamn content, though. Now, Ikemoto, sticking with the theme of pulling at my heartstrings, proceeds to say, for me, it comes from Master Kishimoto himself. It's not really about striking words, but more from the fact that I observed him for 15 years, drawing every week. It was very hard. It was like he was going to die, but observing him and seeing his work taught me a lot, and I wanted to be like him. And yeah, honestly, if you've ever seen the schedule that Kishimoto kept while he was drawing Naruto, here, let me read it to you. So it's broken out into 2 separate camps. During the preparation of the manuscript, sketching / rough draft inking, Kishimoto would work from midnight to 6 a.m. He would then sleep from 6 a.m. to 9 a.m. and then work from 9 a.m. to 1 p.m. 1 p.m. to 2 p.m. he would eat lunch. 2 p.m. to 11 p.m. he would work. 11 p.m. to 12 a.m. it would be dinner plus bath time. But you're probably thinking to yourself,
Wait, Nick. You only said sleeping one time and it was those 3 hours.
and yeah, I know. While Kishimoto was drawing manga, he slept for 3 hours a night. He worked for 80% of the day. But don't worry, it got easier when he was preparing his storyboarding and planning and conceptualizing, because then he would only work from 10 p.m. to 3 a.m. and then sleep from 3 a.m. to 9 a.m. And then 9 a.m. to 1 p.m. he would search for resources, materials, and watch videos. 1 p.m. to 3 p.m. he would eat lunch and clean. 3 p.m. to 8 p.m. he would work. And then 8 p.m. to 10 p.m. it was dinner plus bath time. Meaning during those periods of his life, he was sleeping for 6 hours a day. And, you know, working 10 hours a day. Now, if you're like,
Well, that second one doesn't sound so bad. I work 10-hour days. Does Kishimoto have soft hands, brother?
Monday through Thursday were the 3 hours of sleep days. The only days he got those 6-hour days were Friday and Saturday. And then he would take 1 day a week off with Sunday. And he did that for 15 years. If I saw somebody do that, I'd be inspired too.
Oh, I want Boruto to be weekly. Boruto doesn't release enough content.
Releasing a manga weekly kills you. Ikemoto continues on by saying the second piece of advice that struck me comes from an interview with Kazuhiko Torishima, Akira Toriyama's editor on Dragon Ball. He said, when you draw, even when the reader is in the middle of the series, you have to continue to attract them so they always want to follow you. This is valuable advice that I try to take into account when I draw. And yeah, that's very good advice. If the 7 deadly frames have taught us anything, if the art falls off, so does the fan base. Looking at you, Tokyo Revengers, as well. My God, what happened? The interviewers then ask Ikemoto a question, saying, Mr. Ikemoto, in Boruto, there's a real desire to use black more than shades of gray. Why? To which Ikemoto responds by saying, maybe my character plays a role in this because I like it when things are either white or black. Also, I can't be bothered to use the frames. And this is actually like a really good question because now that I'm looking at it, yeah, no, there really isn't that much gray in Boruto. It's really just a lot of black and white. But I kind of like it. I don't know. Maybe people want more gradation and shading, but I think it looks good. The interviewers then kick back in by asking, have you been thinking more about the foreign market since the manga has been a colossal success there? For example, do you think about the reactions that the manga you draw can provoke in France? To which Kishimoto, rather truthfully, but also kind of disheartenedly, responds by saying, basically, no, I don't pay attention to what could happen abroad. On the other hand, for the animated adaptation, I have already selected animators who are able to please the whole world. And, hold up. Time out. See, because, well, yeah, you know, unfortunately, Kishimoto was like, no, I don't give a shit about everywhere else that's not named Japan. You know what he did? Just saying there? I've selected the animators for the continuation of Boruto's anime adaptation. Huh? This means that Masashi Kishimoto, one of the most powerful mangakas of all time, saw what was happening with his anime adaptation, literally walked to the studio Perry out and was like, nah, pulled the plug on the anime and was like, you know what? We're gonna do this my way, and selected a team of animators for the continuation of Boruto. This man said, you are not going to ruin my IP. I'm gonna make it look gorgeous. And now I have more faith than ever that it will be just that. Not only that, this is the first actual confirmation we've gotten that Boruto is going to be continued, which is huge news. Now, as to what capacity Boruto is going to return, we don't know. Are they just going to continue from where the story left off? Maybe. Are they going to start a whole new thing? Maybe. We can't say. However, Ikemoto, who's possibly had more media training than Kishimoto, says that I knew that Naruto was very successful abroad and in France. Also, for Boruto, I have the rest of the world in mind, including France. So good job, Ikemoto. One of the interviewers then asks a really dumb question, which is, in your opinion, what is a good manga? To which the both of them just say, an interesting manga. The interviewers then continue on by saying, Mr. Kishimoto, is there a passage from Naruto that you would have liked to explore further? And it's at this point that Kishimoto says something that I never would have expected from him, which is, yeah, I would have liked to develop Sakura, the main female character, further. Since I am a man, it was more difficult for me to fathom a woman's heart. What? You're telling me Masashi Kishimoto, the creator of some of the worst female characters of all time, wanted to spend more time on Sakura and is openly aware of the fact that he struggled to write women. This is a level of self-awareness I was unaware of. And like, yeah, man, we would have loved that too. We thought that's why you gave her her own light novel. And seeing this kind of sentiment for Kishimoto really makes my heart smile, because not only is Sakura a lot of people's favorite character, but also makes me feel as though that he's heading into Boruto with the realization that he needs to flesh out his ability to write women more, which could probably explain Sarada and Himawari's step up in relevance. The interviewers then ask, how did you imagine this training stage in which Naruto recovers the experience generated by his clones? Basically asking Kishimoto, how did you think of the idea of Naruto training with his shadow clones to do things like master the Rasen Shuriken faster? To which Kishimoto responds by saying, it all started with this thought. If only it could happen like this. Because let's say that I could clone myself, that all my clones could draw the panels of my manga, and that I accumulated all the experience to improve my drawing. That would be ideal. So you heard it here first, ladies and gentlemen. Naruto is a self-insert OC, and an incredibly tired and beat down mangaka was like, wow, wouldn't it be nice if we could expedite learning? And I believe genuinely this answer harkens back to something he said earlier, where he was like, yeah, I was drawing the manga weekly. If I had an idea, it went in the manga. The interviewers then ask, in your opinion, why is Naruto a hero who's still so popular 25 years after his creation and 10 years after his end? Now, Ikemoto, rather interestingly, is the one to answer this by saying, I think that many people can identify with Naruto depending on the situation or context. Those who cannot are much fewer. He is a hero for whom we have empathy and whom we understand. And Kishimoto responds by saying, I think it's because Naruto is an imperfect hero. And that's fair. Well, Naruto is really pretty, and the fight animation is incredible. The real draw to the story is the human stories. The interviewers then asked, the Boruto series, unlike its predecessor, has a monthly pre-publication. What are the differences in the workplace and in the narration? To which Kishimoto responds by saying, I only have experience with the weekly, and I think that the monthly rhythm seems cooler. Ikemoto then kicks in by saying, I want to tell you that the monthly rhythm is still difficult, but I realized that I would be incapable of maintaining a weekly publication. And my God, the fact that anybody is able to do it is wild. The interviewers then ask, how do you communicate together? Do you work on the drawing and the scenario together or separately? And this is, once again, where this interview gets very interesting. Kishimoto says, in the case of Boruto, I initially wrote the outline of the story, but in a very succinct manner. We then held a meeting to discuss it. It is really Master Ikemoto who is fully in charge of Boruto. And that's kind of nuts for a couple of reasons. Basically, what Kishimoto was saying here is that he's planned out the entirety of Boruto. While in a bare bones, probably easily explainable in 15 or so minutes way, the beginning, middle, twists, and end of Boruto were all planned out by Kishimoto. Because in fact, that a lot of people out there are constantly saying that, oh, Kishimoto doesn't write on Boruto. This pretty much flatly proves that wrong. However, not 100% wrong, because Kishimoto does say that while I built the outline, Ikemoto is pretty much in charge of Boruto, which means rather differently from how I hypothesized a couple of days ago, Kishimoto laid out the plot points that Ikemoto has to get to. And Ikemoto follows up Kishimoto's statement with something rather interesting, saying that at the beginning, Master Kishimoto did indeed share his story with me, but the further we go, the more the plot becomes different from what it was initially planned. Today, I discuss the rest of the scenario with my editor every month, so I think that Master Kishimoto does not yet know what will happen in the rest of Boruto. Do you hear the words out of his mouth? This means technically what was laid out by Kishimoto in the very beginning may not be how the story will end. And as Kishimoto seems to trust Ikemoto implicitly, it seems as though Ikemoto may be trying to steer the path to Boruto away from what Kishimoto originally planned. And while for a lot of you that might be a huge red flag and alarms might be blaring in the back of your mind, I'd like to remind you that Kishimoto is openly admitting that Boruto is Ikemoto's project, and therefore everything that's happened in Two Blue Vortex happened through Ikemoto. But this is Ikemoto, the author writer and apparently lead showrunner on Boruto, saying that, yeah, what we were doing in the beginning of Boruto, I'm actually changing. So, well, like I said, this interview doesn't do a whole lot for the building out of my point that the 10 paths will retcon the beginning of Boruto. It does bring up a couple of interesting points to chew on. Kishimoto then responds to this by saying, that way I get to enjoy reading Boruto, which is crazy. Kishimoto doesn't even know what's happening in his own sequel IP. And with this, we're led to the final question of the interview, where the interviewers asked, the series entered a more serious phase with Two Blue Vortex. Where did the idea of making Boruto a renegade come from? Now, Ikemoto responds to this by saying, it's not that Boruto is really a traitor. Yeah, we know, but when his adventure began, he had a situation opposite to that of Naruto in the past. He had friends and a family, his main problem being an absent father, which, like, I would argue is actually one of Naruto's problems as well, but whatever, go off. So he didn't have any particular reason to surpass himself, but since he is the main character, we had to find a way to make him act. For his part, Kawaki has a similar situation to Naruto. I thought that swapping the position between Boruto and Kawaki would allow for a better progression of the story. It's an idea I had relatively early on. It's an idea that Ikemoto had relatively early on, which means that the firing of Omnipotence and the swapping of Kawaki and Boruto, a major, massively important plotline in Boruto, was Ikemoto's idea, not Kishimoto's. Considering the fact that what was said in the last couple of questions, with Ikemoto diverting the plot away from Kishimoto's original master plan, that seems to confirm that we are nowhere near Kishimoto's initial idea for Boruto. Like, Omnipotence and the swapping of Boruto and Kawaki is a huge plot point. I'd argue outside of the kidnapping of Naruto, the treeifying of Sasuke, and the death of Momoshiki and Ishiki, it's the biggest plot point in Boruto. Kishimoto then kicks in by saying, in Naruto, there's a rivalry between the hero and Sasuke. I'd already imagined a situation where their situations would have been reversed. So Master Ikemoto experienced it through Boruto. I can see this change of position, but as a reader, I take full advantage of it because I'm the first to be able to read the manga in order to do the verifications. Being the first reader of Boruto is a joy, which all but confirms that it was Ikemoto's idea to swap Boruto and Kawaki. Ikemoto then signs off by saying, drawing a manga is really hard, but I will do my best to offer interesting work. I count on your support. The interviewers then ask if they have any last words for the group. Kishimoto then finishes off by saying, we should not always say that drawing a manga is difficult, otherwise young mangakas will be discouraged. It is true that it is hard, but I think that there will be more and more new authors and that the Japanese manga will continue to develop, including the Shonen Jump magazine. There will always be very good anime adaptations. Manga is already an important element of Japanese culture and will continue to be so. Thank you for continuing to read manga. And it's this point that Ikemoto, probably upset that he was getting somewhat scolded by his mentor, said, I said that drawing manga was difficult, but rest assured, I love it. I enjoy being able to do it, don't worry. And with that, we've reached the end of the interview. And wow, is that a lot to unpack. I mean, with the conclusion of this interview, the relationship between Kishimoto and Ikemoto is no longer up to question. We know exactly how Boruto was made. We know who's writing on it. But while it was stated that Kishimoto retook over the helm at chapter 52, it appears as though that only Kodachi was fired, and that Kishimoto, while he laid out the entirety of the plot for Boruto, may not have actually laid out what will end up being the plot of Boruto. Ikemoto seems to be making massive changes to Kishimoto's original plan, and none of them seem to be all that bad. In fact, I'd argue that a lot of the changes created by Ikemoto are some of the most compelling storylines in all of Boruto. And more than anything, Kishimoto seems very pleased with how it's going. So talk about massively important interviews. I can't wait to wait another decade until I get to hear Kishimoto talk again. But what do you guys think was the most important thing discussed in this interview? Tell me in the comments below. And while you guys are down there, please, for me, like this video, subscribe to the page, and hit that noti bell. Why France? Anywhere but France, except for Nice and Paris. I went both those places, and they were actually really nice, and everyone was really nice to me, and the food was really good. But why France?